Before British colonisation in Australia, the Australian Aboriginal people had developed many strong, unique cultural traditions, various languages, and thorough knowledge of the environment. After the British colonisation, many conflicts arose between the British and the Aboriginals, and that eventually spiraled to the Australian government attempting to eliminate any elements of their race and culture. In 1869, Victoria passes the Aboriginal Protection Act, the first threat to the Indigenous Australians' rights. Under this law, the governor had the ability to remove any Aboriginal children from their families if they were deemed to be neglected or unprotected. These children were then sent off to reserves, missions, or white families. This act was soon followed by similar acts throughout the other 6 states and territories in Australia. The Australian government believed these Aboriginals to be uncivilized and unfit for white society. Consequently, the goal of taking these children away was to assimilate them into white society and eradicate their race out of Australian society through breeding over generations.
You know the word assimilate? Try and make us white fellas. That's what they did. They don't tell us that we weren't black. They were white. And you're not to mix with any other Aboriginal kids at school. You were to keep to yourself.
The assimilation of the Aborigines was a threat to their culture and their heritage, as they were taught to believe that their old culture was wrong and that they would have to need to change in order to be accepted in society. This suppression of many Aboriginal people's cultures grew and continued, gradually giving the government more and more control over them and their societies. In 1897, Queensland passes the Aboriginal Protection and Restriction on the Sale of Opium Act. This act appoints the Chief Protector to become the legal guardian of every child under the age of 16. Under this law, the Chief Protector can move Aboriginal people to and from reserves, institutes, missions, or into white families, and strip the right from families to have their own children.
Two-year-old Faye was rescued by a territory policeman who found her abandoned. They've been cared for by the Methodist Mission, and now they live in a 15-room mansion. Mr. Deutscher says he believes it's possible to integrate Aboriginals into white families. Christine certainly seems to be proving that Mr. Deutscher is right, and so does Faye. It's all so new to them, and they're still a little wide-eyed.
These reserves were intended to keep Aborigines out of white society and reprogram them in an attempt to assimilate them into Australian white society. These kids were made to distance themselves from their own culture and language and adopt Australian white culture. These reserves were administered by the government, or in some cases by the church, and conditions in the reserves were harsh and abusive, and children were punished severely. Kinshela Boys Home, located on formerly Aboriginal land in New South Wales, was one of these reserves. Here, children were subject to abuse, hard labor, and attempts to convert them from their heritage.
The worst punishment for us was if you spoke back to one of the white staff, you were sent up the line. That means about 60 to 70 kids all stand in a line, and when you went to pass, they all had to hit you. Now the manager would walk with the bloke that was being punished to make sure that everybody did hit him, and not a little hit, you had to hit him hard as you could. And if they didn't, then they were sent up the line. So he'd make sure that 60 or 70 kids hit this bloke, and of course when he got to the other end there'd be blood everywhere, and then it was locked in a little room like a toilet, and fed on bread and water for 3 days.
The goal of this home, like many others, was for the full-blood Aborigines to die there, and the mixed-race or half-caste children to learn to identify themselves as a lesser version of white Australians. The abuse of Aborigine rights was not only prominent in the kidnappings of children and the reserves they were sent to, but also for any Aborigines living in Australian society. Aside from facing discrimination and fear in public, throughout many states in Australia, the Aborigines Protection Act allowed the police to control rations to Aborigines, including refusing them rations to persuade them to go to reserves. Police could also decide whether an Aborigine was sick enough to seek medical help and punish parents who tried to evade the removal of their children to reserves. Throughout the 1950s, protests and a growing demand for change, combined with other countries transitioning to more equal rights, led to more light being shown upon the mistreatment of Aborigines to the public. The first state to stop the forcible removal of Aborigines from their homes was Western Australia in 1960, and by 1969, all states had repealed their similar legislation. Later, in 1980, several link-up services were established by the government to attempt to reunite stolen children with their original family. During these years, the Australian government passed several acts attempting to undo what damage they had done.
Can't do nothing now, because you always got the police watching you. It's like if something go wrong in Morwell, cops go straight to me. I'll get the blame for it. They'll just grab me, handcuff me, take me back to the police station and chuck me in the cells. Can't do nothing about it.
While these actions certainly give some rights back to the Aborigines, their everyday lives are still heavily impacted and their heritage is still suppressed. As a result of their past trauma, Australian Aboriginal people are forever changed in many ways. Even after several reforming laws were passed, discrimination still continues today, and many people still see Aboriginals as lesser.
Leave them well alone. The ones that are no good to themselves and can't accept things, the half-caste, and this is where most of the trouble comes, I would dope the water up so that they were sterile and would breed themselves out in the future, and that would solve the problem.
In the current day, the return of rights to the Australian Aboriginal people is still not nearly finished. A 2017 study shows that stolen generation survivors are 50% more likely to be charged by police and are 10% less likely to have a job as compared to other Australians. Many have lost connections with their culture and religion, along with many languages going extinct. Additionally, 1 in 7 stolen generation survivors live today with a severe disability. Another result is the unreturned right for them to be with their family and difficulties finding their relatives due to name changes made while on the reserves.
So I was a lost child for many years, but I was always saying to myself, well, a real blackfella shouldn't be shooting white powder up his arse.
This was the story of the removed rights and harsh responsibilities given to Aboriginal people in Australia throughout the stolen generations, and shows the effects of what these actions have created for the Aboriginal people today.